When a form of media changes developmental hands, the natural end result of the product is going to look rather different from its predecessor. This is even true for Fallout, with lots of debate about how Bethesda has handled the atmosphere and aesthetics compared to Black Isle. Which begs the question, did Bethesda ruin the Fallout aesthetic? So, let's take a look at a few arguments for and against this idea. We'll start with the Wastelands themselves, the actual locations the games take place. Mind you, we're mostly talking about the base games rather than the DLCs. So, New California, the Mojave, the Capital, the Commonwealth, and the Appalachia Wastelands. To add, we'll be discussing how the settlers have adapted to these lands. And we'll be talking about the humor presented in these games, particularly the zanier humor. Finally, we'll discuss things from a certain design standpoint, gameplay and art choices. While this isn't too focused on the world, at least not from a lore standpoint, it does impact how the player experiences it. It's also a pretty broad topic that could branch out in many ways, so I'll be glossing over it for this video. And a special thanks to NoDareT for this idea. I was running out of things to talk about for my Bethesda Ruin video series, and this one sounded pretty good to go on. So, let's begin. The various wastelands of each Fallout have their own different styles to them. The original games take place in New California, well, what would eventually become New California depending on your timeline and definitions. Heavily deserted areas with a variety of settlements with a number of different looks. While Fallout 1 has Junktown, which I believe influenced Megaton in Fallout 3, and features a bunch of people living in makeshift homes of scrap parts, it also featured Shady Sands, the future capital of NCR, that have Adobe-style homes that they made themselves. There's also the Hub and Aditum, which use pre-war homes and buildings as their settlements. This continues into Fallout 2, with places like Modoc that feature both scrap homes and built-up homes, or Klamath almost entirely living out of pre-war homes, as well as Shady Sands expanding on creating their own homes, even making roads and sidewalks. Similar is true for Vault City, but with a more futuristic flair. New Reno is surprisingly clean compared to the other locations, but it was shielded by the mountains and suffered little structural damage, as stated in the Fallout 2 guide. Fallout 1 features a number of small territories packing together to survive. They have farming, cattle herding, and caravans. Fallout 2 is more of an evolution of that, where specific governments have formed and organized the flow of goods and services between large areas. So the people of New California features something of a story about adapting to their territory and progressing into larger nations. Shady Sands went from a humble starting town to a powerful country with nearly 1 million people and growing industries. New Vegas is a bit of a continuation of Fallout 2, large armies and numbers, civilized, a lot of scrap homes out in the Mojave, but not so much freshly built homes like those in New California. But there is, however, a lot of farming and herding. They seem to do pretty well, even with Deathclaws and Cazadors. Fallout 3 is a bit different than that. The towns in Fallout 3 are something more akin to Fallout 1, in that they're towns with small governing bodies a bit separated from each other beyond some caravans. However, they don't have the same level of craftsmanship that the older Fallout settlers do, living in scrap homes, old ships, and old buildings. Nothing really done with stone, bricks, wood, or anything like that. Fallout 3 lives in the idea of what a post-apocalyptic world would look like for most people. The vision of smashed up buildings, a struggle for survival, suffering each day. For many, that's what Fallout should be, that idea. And the original Fallouts don't entirely have that. 1 does a lot more than 2, but not really to the same effect. The LA Boneyard is the closest thing to the DC ruins when discussing this context. But what makes it jarring for many older fans is that strong civilization development from 1 and 2. And then we see the Capital Wasteland, and it's as if nothing truly progressed. It's most like Fallout 1's development, which is a difference of 116 years. You'd expect something more resembling Fallout 2 by the timeline alone. Yet, the environment does scream it's closer to pre-war times, something more akin to 76's placement of 25 years after the Great War. Store foods that apparently have really powerful preservatives, people talking about the Great War as if it's something recent, and radiation being everywhere when most sources predict it would dissipate after a few years. Some also raise flags about a reliable source of food. Famously, there's Megaton, with only a single Brahmin. However, what makes this all weird is that Bethesda did care at one point to say the Capital Wasteland could grow crops. In fact, Fallout 3's Hilltop Farm Ruin has a whole terminal dedicated to agriculture and speaks about how they had irrigation. And based on the word choices, it even suggests that it was shortly after the Great War, where radiation would have been at its highest. So they can grow food, but it doesn't appear to be a common thing. And in Rivet City, growing food is a scientific experiment by Dr. Lee. Is Hilltop the only place that could? It's hard to say. Still, it does seem to suggest that the Southwest had a better handle on the situation. One thing that is a consideration for the state of the Capital Wasteland is the differences in circumstances. Fallout 3 has the DC ruins, a huge priority for nukes, the regular early on super mutant threat, and a high amount of desertification and radiation that looks like it may have ruined stable agriculture. And if 76 is anything to go by, may have been a target of Deathclaws very early on in the timeline. Not to mention the Yaguai. There's so many problems plaguing the Capital Wasteland that it's almost a miracle that they've survived for this long. Compared to the New California Wasteland that has a stable agricultural system, despite the desert-heavy Southwest, only had to deal with super mutants and Deathclaws fairly close to the same time, and does not have to deal with Yaguai and benefited from the Vault Dweller coming to save the day, it's fairly reasonable that the NCR would form. But in the Capital Wasteland, there's so many problems that I do think there should have been something to make their survival more believable. Just a reliable crop at least. A Capital Wasteland potato to save the day. That being a source of food that can grow in a rough climate, but they may have that potato being the Brahmin. How can a Brahmin be this potato? Cows eat 24 pounds of food a day. Well, according to Fallout Bible 9, wild Brahmin can forage for themselves, and they can be found across the wastes, gathered into small herds, wandering here and there, munching on the dirty weeds scattered throughout the desert. Fortunately for the ecology of the wasteland and the survival of their species, Brahmin could go for long periods of time without water. They don't need much to survive. And back to Hilltop, well, this is reinforced in one of their entries. Irrigation and fertilization have been good, though we lost a few goats and chickens. The cows have done good. Those hardy beasts don't seem to mind this new world. Miles and Jackie are devoting some time to husbandry to keep the cows breeding and available. However, that alone is not enough to support the Capital Wastelanders. There's little in the way of vitamin C, and scurvy would be a concern. Still, even with all the hardships that Capital Wastelanders face, there's plenty of them, which makes going to the Commonwealth a bit of a strange situation. Fallout 4 has a lot more vegetation around. While there does appear to be some level of desertification going on, there's plenty of trees, grass, and a farming mechanic with a variety of crops. It makes it a lot more believable. Heck, even Diamond City addresses the issue of farming compared to Megaton. Crops are right in the middle of town. The Commonwealth appears to be infinitely better off compared to the Capital Wasteland. Yet, Fallout 4 lacks a number of settlements. The population appears to be very low, having only 2, maybe 3 or 4 depending on your definition, of normal NPC towns in the game, compared to the number of player settlements. It makes a town to hostile mob ratio feel very off. The hostility of the Capital Wasteland seems to be far more hazardous than that of the Commonwealth. Even McCready agrees. Yet, it feels like there's more people in the capital. It's just odd. A large reason for that is that the player settlement system takes up a lot of room, and it feels like they've replaced normal towns for the sake of building grounds. Despite the high amount of life, variety of types of creatures, it makes the Commonwealth feel lifeless, which is unfortunate. And it is a bit like 76 in that regard, which holds this to a much truer and more intentional statement. 76 has a number of different biomes, from heavily polluted ones with intense stripping of the plant life, to a foresty one with a ton of creatures. It's actually pretty reasonable to expect this wasteland to lay a strong foundation to build a society from, and perhaps it will. We can look at the settlement of, well, Foundation, and see them developing homes made out of wood and working to improve their situation. And this is only 26 years after the Great War. It has a pretty reasonable sense of realism. But this is after the Wastelanders update, a year after the base game. Prior to that, the original 76 had no human NPCs. Everyone was dead due to the scourged plague. Still, the history we find of the original inhabitants was something of a bit of a hopeful situation, working to improve themselves. Like the Responders, it acts as a bit of a juxtaposition when compared to the other games. But maybe that's something we should be expecting. Different parts of the world, different situations, and by extension, different advantages and disadvantages. West Virginia isn't really a high priority target. It's a state with a total of 1.8 million people. The biggest city of West Virginia has 47,000 people. Short of maybe the White Springs Resort, there's really nothing a country would care about to destroy in West Virginia. But White Springs' purpose didn't become public knowledge, like its real-life equivalent of the Greenbrier Bunker, and that story was broken in 1992. That sparing of the worst nuclear bombs honestly makes the state a pretty great place to build from because it's rich in natural resources. If it weren't for the Scorched Plague, West Virginia would probably be a powerhouse in the current Fallout timeline. While these different wastelands don't all fit together nicely, I do think each one of them had their own challenges to face. But some of these challenges may be more meta than in-world. After all, Fallout 4 did appear to suffer from the focus on settlement building, seeming to chop away at NPC towns. Now we'll discuss comedy, a rather subjective thing. One person may find something funny while another finds it awkward. So here's an example of two things that are both fairly outlandish, but handled in different ways, and have different levels of acceptance by the fandom. Fallout 3 has Canterbury Commons, which features a rather small quest with two people essentially cosplaying as comic book characters and have a regular war in the streets. Aunt Agonizer with her ants and the Mechanist with his robots. The concept is very odd to say the least. While these are more or less normal people with some debatability in regards to the Aunt Agonizer, they go on this long dramatic presentation of themselves as a superhero and supervillain, much to the annoyance of many residents. It's silly and plenty of people find it fun, and I would say more people enjoy it than not, based on what I've seen. But there are some people, like myself, who don't particularly care for it. Meanwhile, Old World Blues features a group of brain-in-a-jar scientists performing very wacky experiments ranging from crazy talking appliances to oversized cyber dogs. It's a wild ride of absolute oddity, and yet it tops many people's favorite DLC for New Vegas. The zaniness isn't limited to here. There are plenty of oddities throughout the titles. A commonly criticized thing would be the skins for 76's power armors. Usually, the dolphin armor is the poster boy for these complaints. But there's a lot of other ones, like the Captain Cosmos skin, one based off Liberty Prime, and even a samurai power armor. Fucking hell, you mean to tell me I didn't have to make shift one in Source Filmmaker? Oh yeah, there's also one based off Frank Horrigan's power armor from Fallout 2. And that's not really wacky, just kinda cool. Thought I'd share. And the zany stuff didn't really start with Fallout 3, it existed in the originals. A lot of special encounters in Fallout 1 were pretty wild. Doctor Who references, a giant dinosaur footprint, and even talking cows. But the silliness isn't limited to special encounters. Fallout 2 is full of pop culture references. Talking plants, talking rats, talking deathclaws, and even a red scorpion capable of playing chess. We can also go back to the much talked about situation with Billy being a pre-war ghoul and how his story compares to that of Coffin Willie. Truthfully, some of the sillier elements of Fallout 2 arguably eclipse those of the newer games. So what makes some silliness good and others bad? The power armor skins of Setting 6 is often criticized, but they're not canon. The chess playing Red Scorpion is very minor, but weird and is canon. The Talking Deathclaws has been attacked by even classic fans, but seem to have become somewhat accepted as the years went on. The Old World Blues DLC is quite beloved, but it encompasses a whole world map. Presentation and handling might be the answer, but that's a bit of an arbitrary answer as well. Choosing the right moment and the right method of presenting something that may break the experiences of the wasteland to not seem too standout is a definite tough task. But of course, zany isn't the only type of humor. Character humor is another, a personality that's funny. Ranging from Renesco of Fallout 2, whose whole interaction with the Chosen One is hilarious, Gallows of Fallout 3 having that same sort of type of humor, though done in a different way.
I'm glad that we understand one another.
Then there's characters like Fantastic or Novark in New Vegas, both of which have eccentric personalities, and both of those became fan favorites. Then there's the low intelligence dialogue, a type of humor that may not be for everyone. A main character speaking in grunts and cliche stupid talk may make some people roll their eyes rather than find them funny. Finally, we'll go over design choices, mostly gameplay and art style. I'm not particularly an authority when discussing art, so bear with me. When it comes to the gameplay, Fallout 3 did attempt to translate a lot of what made the originals work in 3D with real-time first-person and optionally third-person combat. Now, this does come with a fair amount of sacrifice. Skills were limited to 100%. There was no strength requirement for weapons, traits were removed, and you gained a perk every level rather than every 3 levels like the original. And a lot of the perks simply gave skill points. but for the most part, it attempted to be fairly faithful. New Vegas did a bit more to be true to the experience of classic Fallout by reversing a lot of these design decisions. While skills were still limited to 100%, the strength requirement came back, traits returned, and you gained a perk every 2 levels rather than 1, and perks were made to be a lot more interesting. What really changed was the styles of Fallout 4 and Fallout 76, which became more combat and loot heavy. Nothing unfamiliar with Fallout, but a lot of the core features of the original interpretation had been stripped away. Special rolled into skills, multiple solutions becoming more scarce, and junk collection went from being something people ignored to something encouraged. And while this doesn't directly affect the Wasteland from a narrative perspective, it does impact your experiences with it. Then again, maybe it does impact the world. The junk collection is a product of settlement building, or at the very least, they go hand in hand. A lot of the more tangible core elements, like ghouls and deathclaws, exist in Fallout 4 and 76, but it feels different with the gameplay. Still, it's there. Heck, I even talked about how 76 seems to really grab for the classic aspect with things like the design of Westech's vats of FEV, the Pip-Boy 2000, and the Plasma Caster, which brings up the design of many of Fallout's creatures and NPCs. As it jumped to 3D, a lot of things underwent a redesign, or exchanged for differences entirely. For instance, the style of iBots changed from a Jetson sort of look to a more rugged and durable look. The Pip-Boy 2000 we see in Fallout 1 and 2 that had a pretty, incomplete look, was also changed to a more rugged and durable style with the Pip-Boy 3000. Fallout 4 expanded on the Pip-Boy 3000 by making it more ergonomic. The P94 Plasma Caster has faded in and out of the franchise multiple times, being originally called the Plasma Rifle in Fallout 1 and 2, and being replaced by an actual rifle in Fallout 3, but was brought back in New Vegas in the form of the Plasma Caster, then removed from 4 only to be brought back in 76. It has a bit of a wild ride. Then there's things like the Vault Suits, tied in Fallout 1 and 2, loose in 3 in New Vegas, only to be tied again in 4 and 76. There's also a change in art style. While Fallout 1 and 2 had this cartoony look going on, Fallout 3 and up jumped for a more realistic look. There's also differences in architecture, like Art Deco and Gothic. One that's a bit controversial is the style in 4 and 76, more specifically, Boston and Watoga. Big colorful towers. I'm not sure what's the best style to describe them would be. Best I can come up with is retrofuturism architecture, which isn't really an exact idea. Maybe atom punk? They certainly look high-tech, something similar to Futurama. Some people really dislike them though, feeling it heavily clashes with the styles we've seen up until this point. And maybe it does, but I also feel this works too. A lot of places have their own styles, and this is plenty of time in the future in an already heavily branched timeline. So, did Bethesda ruin the aesthetics and atmosphere? This one's really tough to say. When it comes to the various wastelands, even within the original, there's a number of different styles of buildings and methods of survival by the Wastelanders. There was plenty of wacky stuff in each game, with different levels of responses. While some basked in Fallout 3's more typical post-apocalyptic world, others felt to stray too far away from the original presentation, which also caused those who enjoyed that style to feel miffed at New Vegas's and 4 to some extent. Gameplay is another consideration. Some feel that the modern titles focus too much on looting and shooting, while others feel that's a fun time overall. I feel there was some missteps, but not something I would have called unsalvageable. Fallout 3 needed a bit more leniency for the Wastelanders. They have it very rough. While the Brahmin is the potato for them, they probably needed a real potato. It's weird when 3 presents us with conflicting information in regards to the agriculture. A terminal says there's a place to farm, but we see next to nothing suggesting that the people can. Fallout 4 had a rather huge gameplay misstep that I feel hurt the world that the player inhabits and tells a completely different story compared to that of 3. While the Commonwealth Wasteland is far more forgiving than the one at the capital, it feels so empty because of the huge focus on settlement building, despite Diamond City being a pretty lively town on its own. And 76 has the biggest advantages as far as the Wasteland's offering, but because of the Scorched Plague, life is incredibly limited, going a similar direction as Fallout 4. Meanwhile, the Wastelands on the West Coast feel pretty cohesive with each other, offering similar things. But to be fair, they're all fairly close to one another. I feel some small rewrites for certain points in the games could have probably helped a lot, particularly with Fallout 3. Fallout 4 and 76, it's a bit more challenging. Fallout 4 will require more NPC towns throughout the game, at least 3 more. In 76, well, the biggest problem there is its own narrative. This focus on the Scorched Plague wiping out the local populations really harms potential for growth. But thanks to Wastelanders, they're back, although it almost sounds like Pokemon discovering a new generation. Ruin, no, but the games definitely should have taken these things into consideration. They were more mishandled, but not something completely and utterly ruined. But what do you think? Did Bethesda ruin the Fallout atmosphere, or do you enjoy it all just fine? And a special thanks to my channel members, especially my Members Thrice Over guys, the Crazy Game Developer, and Danny McPhee. And if you want to support me and join as well, I'd be more than happy. Also, feel free to join my Discord server and chat with us. Thank you. Have a good one.